Welcome, Detective Geathers.
Good evening. Some murders begin with rage, some begin with greed, some begin with revenge. This one began with patience. What Detective Shiela Geathers is about to share with you tonight is not the story of a killer who lost control. It is the story of a killer who possessed complete control. The investigation began on a warm summer evening in Cunningham Park, Queens, where families gathered beneath trees, children played in open fields, and smoke drifted lazily from barbecue grills. It was the type of scene most people associate with safety and normalcy. Fathers cooked food while friends laughed nearby. Parents watched their children play. It was the kind of place where danger felt impossible. Then, without warning, a man collapsed. No one heard an argument. No one witnessed a confrontation. No one saw an attacker emerge from the crowd. One moment the victim was standing among family and friends, and the next moment he was lying motionless on the ground. What investigators would soon discover was far more disturbing than a random act of violence. The victim had not been selected by chance. He had not been targeted in a moment of anger. He had been observed, studied, chosen. And before Detective Geathers completed her examination of the first murder scene, another victim was already unknowingly moving toward the same fate. Detective, tell the audience what you found that evening.
When I arrived at Cunningham Park, the first thing that struck me was not the victim. It was the atmosphere surrounding the scene. Homicide scenes often contain a kind of chaos. Witnesses point in different directions. People remember fragments of events. Emotions overwhelm logic. This scene felt different. There was confusion, certainly, but there was also something else. There was absence. No one could tell us where the killer had gone because no one had ever seen him. No one could describe a confrontation because none had occurred. The violence had happened so quickly and so efficiently that dozens of people found themselves standing inside a murder scene without understanding they had witnessed a murder. The victim was Ronald Mercer, a 47-year-old accountant, husband, father of 3 children, and youth baseball coach. By every account, he was an ordinary man living an ordinary life. Friends described him as dependable. His family described him as devoted. Nothing in his background suggested he had enemies. Nothing in his recent activities suggested he was in danger. Yet there he was, dead in the middle of a public park surrounded by people who cared about him. While crime scene personnel processed the area around Ronald, I began examining the larger environment. The victim's position, the locations of witnesses, and the physical layout of the park all suggested something important. The killer had not been standing nearby. The evidence suggested distance. The evidence suggested concealment. Most importantly, the evidence suggested preparation. As I moved through the park, I found myself drawn repeatedly toward a section of trees overlooking the picnic area. From that location, a person could observe families without attracting attention. A person could remain hidden. A person could wait. The physical evidence supported that theory. The geometry of the scene indicated that whoever committed the murder understood the area well enough to identify a concealed observation point. This was not someone who stumbled upon a victim. This was someone who selected a location, selected an opportunity, and then waited for exactly the right moment. Witness interviews only deepened that concern. Most people remembered very little. Some thought they had seen movement among the trees. Others remembered feeling as though someone had been watching the gathering. One statement in particular stayed with me. A young child told investigators that someone had been watching Ronald while he cooked at the grill. Children often notice details adults dismiss, and that statement bothered me because it implied something profoundly disturbing. Watching requires time. Time requires patience. Patience requires intent. The victim had not simply encountered the killer. The killer had spent time observing him. As investigators reconstructed Ronald Mercer's life, we discovered another troubling detail. Ronald maintained a highly active social media presence. There was nothing unusual about it. family photographs, travel plans, sporting events, restaurant visits, gatherings with friends. He shared details of his life the same way millions of people do every day. Yet as we reviewed his activity, we began seeing it through a different lens. Ronald wasn't simply sharing memories. He was documenting his routines. He was creating a record of where he would be, when he would be there, and how often he followed predictable patterns. That realization changed the investigation immediately. Ronald Mercer was not vulnerable because of who he was. He was vulnerable because of how visible he had become.
Detective, when did you begin to suspect that Ronald Mercer was not an isolated victim and that someone else might already be in danger?
The answer came from instinct before it came from evidence. There was something deeply unsettling about the amount of preparation reflected in the crime. The offender appeared disciplined. He appeared methodical. There was no sign of panic, no indication of improvisation, and no evidence suggesting the killing had been spontaneous. Everything pointed toward a process. In my experience, offenders who develop processes tend to repeat them. They refine them. They become comfortable with them. The more I studied Ronald's life and the circumstances surrounding his death, the more convinced I became that I was looking at the beginning of something rather than the end of it. Over the next 2 days, detectives reviewed surveillance footage, interviewed witnesses, analyzed digital records, and searched for any connection that might explain why Ronald had been selected. We found no disputes, no threats, and no obvious motives. What we found instead was a pattern of visibility. Ronald lived his life openly. His routines were accessible. His movements were predictable. As investigators discussed the evidence, a theory began emerging. What if the offender was not choosing specific people? What if he was choosing specific behaviors? What if the victims were being selected because they unknowingly revealed too much about themselves? At the time, it was only a theory. We had no way of knowing how quickly it would be tested. 2 nights later, another call came in. The second victim lived in a different borough. He worked in a different profession. He had no known connection to Ronald Mercer. Yet, when I arrived at the scene, the feeling was immediate and unmistakable. The same sense of preparation, the same sense of observation, the same feeling that the victim had been selected long before the violence occurred. As officers secured the residence, I stood outside looking at the house and felt something I rarely allow myself to feel during an active investigation: dread. Because I no longer believed I was investigating a single murder. I believed I was watching the emergence of a pattern.
Detective, if Ronald Mercer had been deliberately selected and a second victim had already appeared less than 48 hours later, what was the discovery inside that second home that convinced you the killer had been studying his victims long before they died?
The answer was sitting in plain sight on a laptop computer. And once investigators understood what they were looking at, we realized something terrifying. The killer wasn't simply finding victims, he was learning them. And by then, he had already started studying the next one.
Thank you for watching this episode of the Case Files of Detective Shiela Geathers. We invite you to join us for another exciting episode in a few days. Have a great evening.